Hi, everybody, and welcome to Unified, a podcast feed from First Church Belmont Unitarian Universalist. We'll be sharing sermons and stories, especially thematic content made new every week. We're so glad you're here, and for more information about who we are and opportunities to grow and deepen, swing by the church on Sundays or check out our website at uubelmont.org. And for now, enjoy this new content. Paul Lederach writes, "The moral imagination is the capacity to imagine something rooted in the challenges of the real world, yet capable of giving birth to something which does not yet exist." Rebecca Parker is a theologian and thinker, a minister, a cellist, one of my most brilliant and kind teachers. She was the president of the Sarking School for the Ministry, the seminary both Lauren and I attended. She was raised in the church and taught a deep love of music early on. In an interview in 2021, she recalls falling asleep as a child with her mother practicing the Bach piano suites in the background. She could read after she learned the piano, but it was the cello that was her great love. By the time she was looking for colleges, she assumed that she would study music, cello performance especially, but inside her there was a struggle. For addition to the music of her childhood, she was also raised to work for social justice. Both of her parents worked to combat racism and injustice. They mobilized against the Vietnam War and then helped serve veterans who returned with PTSD. So she started college. She felt some conflict bubbling up inside of her as to whether the path of music was enough for her. She longed also to serve the world and wondered if committing to a life of music performance was truly her purpose. So in addition to her music studies, she also studied philosophy and religion. And there she discovered the process, theology, and thought of Alfred North Whitehead. She says, "I found in Whitehead a philosophical system that gave me a way to really delve into this question of music and social change. At the heart of it," she says, in process theology, Whitehead defines nature as actuality, as a process of integration and relationship. She says the bringing together of things is the process, is existence itself, is actual occasions. It is being itself, impermanent and momentary. She says, for me, all of the sudden there was this link I could see between the artistic process, what music does, what poetry does. It's always about creating relationships, bringing one thing up against another to create a third thing. What art does is connected to this fundamental process of existence. So it wasn't extraneous, she thought. Poetry not extraneous, music not extraneous, but rather all of these art-making activities are analog for being, becoming itself. In that moment especially, it was Whitehead's definition of evil that helped her the most. He says that the process of evil is a process of anesthetization, a loss of feeling. So the problem of the soul being anesthetized or disconnected, for her it was so clear then the need is the medicine, the ministry of arts that teach patterns of soulfulness, of connections, relationships of vitality. She would go on to serve in ministry and in leadership, always infusing music and arts into all that she did. She called us and calls us still to what she calls the aesthetic imperative, infusing this theology in all of her thought, all of our own lives, this synthesis of the artistic and the intellectual, doing away with the dualism that would even think those two things are separate, but living in this connected, relating middle, which holds the many all at once. Here, in this moment, we are in that same kind of dynamic, creative space, this process space. Alive with this beautiful music always, alive with this space in between us, infusing our awareness and our resistance with the aliveness and the creativity which calls us forward, especially now. Again, Paul Lederach writes, "The moral imagination is the capacity to imagine something rooted in the challenges of the real world, yet capable of giving birth to that which does not yet exist." It says violence is the behavior of someone incapable of imagining other solutions to the problem at hand. It says the moral imagination rises with the capacity to imagine ourselves in relationship, embracing this complexity without reliance on dualistic polarity. This creative act, this acceptance of this inherent risk to break violence and venture on unknown paths, this is how we build constructive change. There is so much violence in this moment. And most likely this will increase in the coming years. There is so much dualistic simplification going on. And in this time of dualism and violence, how can we risk the complexity of the non-dual? How can we create in the face of violence spaces and experiences of beauty and truth? Walter Brueggemann, who has written extensively on the biblical prophets, writes, "Every totalitarian regime is frightened of the artist. It is the vocation of the prophet to keep alive the ministry of imagination, to keep conjuring and proposing futures alternative to the single one the king wants to urge as the only thinkable one." I keep coming back in my mind to the story of the pears bursting forth on the winter apple trees. Some of you heard Lauren tell it in one of our snowy internet worships recently, many, many years ago, in a time of great violence and suppression. A time which in many ways forged our Transylvanian cousins, the time of Ceausescu. So much violence, so much fear. And in the height of his power, he says that he will reign until pears grow on apple trees. And it's winter, the season of the sticks, and so the apple trees stand with bare branches. And it's a band of actors and artists who hatched an idea. They made pears out of paper mache, and they filled the apple trees with pears. When they discovered the act of civil disobedience, Ceausescu is enraged. He orders that the artists be found and put to death, and some were. But those pears and the moral imagination which helped give birth to them were part of the uprising which would eventually overthrow the oppressive regime. And that act of imagination, that artistic disobedience, resonates through history to this moment. This has always been part of our lived faith, our vibrant and engaged faith, gathering us in, creating this holy space between us, opening here in this space to our imagining and our dreaming, creating this dynamic space in which we see with open eyes and hearts the full challenges before us, And we react with this creative, life-giving truth and beauty and goodness. We lift up the truth we know. We experience this beauty, this music, remembering over and again the truths of how we can be in this world, reconstituting our selfhood through this beauty. And we share this beauty with the hurting world. Some of you know this story, but you might not know the end. At 4 p.m. on May 27th, a long line waited patiently for bread outside of one of the last functional bakeries in the city. And a mortar shell drops in the middle of it, killing 22 people instantly. Vedran Smilovic looked out of his window and saw blood, bone, rubble. At the time, he was a recognized, exceptionally talented cello player in so many orchestras and symphonies around Sarajevo. Looking back on it, he said that he and his associates were totally naive. So great was their confidence in unity and plurality, he says, that even while they were watching what was happening in the rest of Yugoslavia, they felt absolutely certain that similar destruction couldn't reach Sarajevo. That dream was, of course, shattered in '92. He felt enraged by what was happening around him, but powerless fundamentally. He wasn't a politician or a soldier. He was just a musician. How could he do anything about the war? And that night, in the long, dark night that followed the massacre, he thought deep. With the dawn of the new day, he decided he would do the thing that he could do. He would make music. And so that night and every evening after that at 4 o'clock, we'd walk to the middle of the street, right where the massacre had happened, dressed formally, as if for a performance, would sit on a battered stool, placed in the crater made by the shell, with his cello, and he would play. Around him still the sounds of war. For 22 days, one day for each of the people who were killed, we played in the same spot. Played to the ruins of homes, smoldering fires, scared people hiding in their basements. Played for the human dignity, which is the first casualty of war. Played for peace. He would go on to play in other places, deciding every day to make some kind of musical prayer for peace. Word of this spread, and an English composer named David Wilde was so moved by the story that he created a composition for unaccompanied cello simply called The Cellist of Sarajevo. Celebrated cellist Yo-Yo Ma played this piece at an international cello festival in England in 1994. Pianist Paul Sullivan was there that day and describes it like this. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, the music began, stealing out into the hushed hall and creating this shadowy, empty universe, ominous with the presence of death, haunting in echoes. Slowly it built, growing relentlessly into an agonized screaming, a slashing furor, gripping us all before subsiding into a hollow death rattle, finally back into the silence from which it came. He says, when he had finished, Yo-Yo Ma remained bent over his cello, his bow resting on the strings. No one in the hall moved. Not a sound was made for a long time. It was as though they had just witnessed the massacre themselves, and finally, in the silence, Yo-Yo slowly straightened in his chair, looked out across the audience, stretched out his hand, and all eyes followed as he beckoned someone to come to the stage. And an indescribable electric shock swept up over us as we realized who it was, the cellist of Sarajevo himself, He rose and he came down, walked to the aisle, and Yo-Yo Ma came off the stage, met him with arms flung wide. They embraced. Here we are, in this rubble, in the midst of this mounting violence, in the midst of all this uncertainty and unknown, and with this great beauty and this singular song within us waiting to be played, with this moral imagination deep within us, all these pairs, all these cellos, all these poems, all this beauty and newness stirring, all flowing from this holy space between. Amen.